Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show that, well, gives you that shortcut to being really well informed. Today, we're jumping into some fascinating research in freshwater ecology. We're looking at how living things actually move around and, survive within these incredibly complex river systems.
Yeah, we're breaking down a really significant paper here. It's a conceptual synthesis led by Jonathan D. Tonkin and colleagues. The title is The Role of Dispersal in River Network Metacommunities, Patterns, Processes, and Pathways.
Right.
Our mission really is to get a handle on how the unique branching shape of rivers shapes biodiversity. All of it.
And this isn't just like an academic exercise, is it? Rivers have this structure that's basically unique on the planet. They aren't just random patches of water.
Not at all.
They're organized into these, what ecologists call hierarchical dendritic networks. Think of like lightning or tree branches. And that physical pattern, it puts limits on how things move that you just don't see elsewhere.
Exactly. And when we say meta-community, we're not just talking about one little spot. We mean the whole collection of local communities.
Yeah.
Everything from tiny invertebrates, fish, plants, even amphibians, all linked up because individuals move between these places.
Okay.
Understanding how they move, that's the key driver, especially when you think about conservation or how climate range or even dams might affect things.
Okay, so let's unpack that physical structure a bit more, this dendritic, this branching pattern. You said location matters.
Oh, absolutely. Because rivers branch and crucially flow one way, where a spot is in the network upstream, downstream, it's almost everything for connectivity.
Right.
It creates this really interesting isolation dynamic. Think about the headwaters, those little streams way, way up at the top.
Okay.
For anything that has to stay in the water to move, like a fish, those headwaters can be incredibly isolated from each other. You might not be able to easily get from one headwater stream to the one in the next valley over without going all the way down to the main river and then all the way back up again.
Wow, so those tiny streams high up might actually be more cut off from each other than places much further apart if you just drew a straight line on a map.
Precisely.
So what's the ecological outcome of that kind of intense isolation?
Well, that isolation often leads to what we call high species turnover. Because movement between them is so hard, the local environment in each little stream really dictates what lives there. So you get unique communities popping up in different headwaters. And collectively, these headwaters can end up supporting a huge amount of the region's total biodiversity. It kind of challenges that old idea that only the big rivers are important.
Interesting. So when organisms do manage to move between these places, the paper talks about this using three classic meta-community ideas, right? What happens first if dispersal is sort of just right, the Goldilocks level?
Yeah, that's what we call species sorting. Basically, the rate of movement is good enough that species can find the specific environmental conditions they like, their preferred niche. So if you're, say, a trout needing cold, fast water, you can actually get to those spots because the network lets you move effectively enough.
But then there's the opposite end, right? Mass effects. I always picture this like the river current, just pushing things where they don't necessarily want to be.
That's a great way to think about it. Mass effects happen when dispersal is super high. Maybe think about a massive flood event.
Right.
It can overwhelm the local environment's control. Species get washed into habitats that aren't actually ideal for them, but they stick around because there's this constant stream of new arrivals keeping the population going, even if they can't reproduce well there.
And then the third one, the one we often worry about in fragmented landscapes, dispersal limitation.
Yeah, this is maybe the simplest but often the biggest issue. It just means dispersal is too low. An organism simply can't reach a perfectly good habitat patch. Maybe there's a waterfall or a dry section of stream in the way. The perfect spot might be right over the hill, but they just can't get there.
Okay, and this is where the Tonkin paper really brings it all together, right? It says the importance of that river network, how much it explains which of those dynamics is happening, is really, really context dependent.
That's the core message. It's not one size fits all. The paper points to two main things that determine how crucial the river network itself is for movement. First, the organism's dispersal mode. Does it swim, fly, or crawl over land?
Okay.
And second, the overall landscape type. Are we talking about a wet music system or a dry, arid one?
Let's dig into that landscape difference. The paper makes this prediction that the network's explanatory power, like how well just measuring distance along the river predicts biodiversity, actually peaks in those wetter music systems, but specifically for things that have to stay in the water. Why that peak?
Well, think about it. In a consistently wet mesic system, the river is like this continuous highway, right? It's highly connected, at least along its length.
Makes sense.
So if you're a fish or some other strictly aquatic creature, the distance along the watercourse is pretty much the only path that matters. Using that water distance and measurement is going to do a really good job predicting which species you find where.
But that predictive power drops off if you go to a dry, arid system or if you start thinking about an insect that can fly overland.
Exactly that. In arid places, the river often breaks up into, say, isolated pools. That aquatic highway just disappears for long stretches.
Right.
So now the organism might have to rely on moving overland flying or maybe crawling during wet periods. Suddenly, the distance along the river channel itself becomes much less important than the ability to cross the land between water patches.
And this points to a huge challenge for scientists doing this work, which the paper definitely flags. You can't actually track every single fish or bug or seed across an entire river basin.
Oh, absolutely not. Imagine trying to quantify dispersal for hundreds of species across thousands of kilometers of river. It's just not feasible.
So what do they do instead?
This is why we rely heavily on spatial dispersal proxies. These are basically mathematical models, ways of representing the potential paths organisms might take.
Okay, so using models to stand in for direct measurement.
Right. And that lets us infer which pathway seems most important. Often we're comparing simple straight line distance, as the crow flies, or Euclidean distance with the watercourse distance, the actual path along the river.
Ah, I see.
If the watercourse distance model does a better job explaining, say, genetic similarities between populations in different spots, we can infer the river itself is the main movement corridor for that species.
Got it. And that leads us into these 4 conceptual models, the paper outlines for connectivity, right? Based on how different organisms might use the landscape.
Yeah, they sort of scale up from thinking about single populations to whole metacommunities.
Okay, what's the first one? The classic river following one.
That's the stream hierarchy model, or SHM. It assumes connectivity pretty much just follows the branching river network, the nested drainage basins. Minimal or no overland dispersal.
So perfect for most fish. Or maybe plants whose seeds float downstream.
Exactly. Things like fish or what are called hydrochoric plants. Yeah, basically plants using water to disperse seeds. That's the SHM world.
Okay, contrast that with the other extreme, the Death Valley model, DVM. What does that scenario look like?
The DVM represents really high isolation. Think of those permanent water holes in a desert, separated by huge dry areas.
Right.
Dispersal is super limited, maybe relies on really rare events like a bird accidentally carrying something or a massive flood that briefly connects things. Local conditions are everything, and mass effects are almost zero.
And then there are a couple of in-between models. The headwater model, HWM, sounds like a shortcut.
It kind of is. The HWM assumes organisms have some ability to move short distances over land, maybe crawling or weak flight.
Okay.
This allows them to connect between nearby small streams, even if those streams don't actually flow into each other directly. Like a caddisfly might emerge from one stream, fly over a small ridge, and lay eggs in the stream in the next little valley.
And the last one, where the river structure itself barely matters, the widespread dispersal model, WDM.
Yeah, this is for situations with really high connectivity across the whole region, pretty much ignoring the river's dendritic pattern.
Driven by what?
Often by mass effects or by really strong flyers. Think of some dragonflies that are such powerful aerial dispersers they can cross large distances over land easily. The river channel itself doesn't constrain them much.
This really highlights that split between different types of organisms. When we focus on those obligate aquatic dispersers, the fish, the snails, those water-dispersed seeds, their movement seems mostly dictated by watercourse distance, right? Following that SHM model.
Generally, yes. Unless you get some massive flood that temporarily links everything up, watercourse distance is usually the best predictor for them.
But the insects with flying adult stages, the aerial dispersers, they completely change the picture.
They really do. And the paper points out there's huge variation within that group. A strong flyer, maybe a large dragonfly, might cross huge areas, even desert, keeping populations connected. But a weaker flyer, like maybe a small stonefly or mayfly, often stays much closer to the water. They might use the river valley itself as a kind of corridor, needing the moisture and shelter, even if they're flying overland short distances.
So that arid versus mesic difference we talked about for a flying insect, it becomes a question of survival cost, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
In a wet area, flying overland might be easy, the river's always nearby. But in a dry, arid landscape, Leaving the water channel is a much bigger risk. Water is scarce.
Exactly. Overland dispersal becomes this high-risk, high-reward necessity. And this is why researchers studying these arid systems are moving beyond just simple straight line or even watercourse distance. They're using more sophisticated tools like cost-distance modeling.
Okay, cost distance. How does that work? It sounds like it tries to account for that risk.
I think of it like planning a hike on a map, but from the organism's perspective. You assign a cost to moving across different types of terrain. So, if you're an aquatic insect needing moisture, the cost of crossing a hot, dry, sun-baked ridge might be extremely high, maybe almost infinite.
Makes sense.
But the cost of following a shady gully, or even a dry stream bed that still holds some moisture or offers shelter, would be much lower. The model then calculates the path of least resistance based on those costs. And they found, for example, with a species like the giant water bug in an arid landscape, a cost-distance path calculated using topography, basically favoring concave areas like gullies, predicted their movement patterns much better than just looking at where the surface water currently was.
That's really neat. It means the potential pathways, the landscape structure, can be more important than the visible water, especially in dry areas.
Yeah.
Okay, widening the view again, what else influences whether organisms stick to the river network or venture overland?
Well, topography itself, the ruggedness of the landscape, is a big one. In relatively flat areas, a strong flyer might easily ignore the river path. But if you put that same river in steep mountains, the paper mentions Himalayan streams as an example, the sheer difficulty of crossing high ridges can force even strong flyers back into following the river valley corridor. It's just too costly or dangerous to go over the top.
And of course, humans get involved. Land use changes, fragmentation.
Oh, definitely. The type of land cover matters hugely for overland dispersal. Trying to cross a cool, dense forest is very different for a small insect than crossing hot, open farmland.
Right.
And then you have the direct physical barriers we build. Dams are the obvious one for fish. But even things like poorly designed road culverts can completely block movement for aquatic species that are strictly confined to the channel. Pollution can also create chemical barriers.
Tying this back to climate change seems critical. Those species most stuck within the network, the poor dispersers, they seem particularly vulnerable.
They are, extremely so. As temperatures warm up, species often need to shift their ranges, usually towards the poles or in mountains, to higher elevations.
Okay.
But if your only way to move is up the river channel, you can eventually hit what's called the summit trap effect. You follow the cold water right up to the highest headwaters, and then the cold water runs out. There's nowhere higher to go. You're literally trapped at the top, facing local extinction.
That's a really stark image. It makes understanding these movement limits incredibly urgent. And the paper also suggests that as the world gets generally drier, more arid.
Yes, the prediction is that we'll likely see more river systems shifting towards that highly isolated Death Valley model state. More fragmentation, less connectivity, less resilience overall in these networks.
Before we get to the future outlook, the authors do mention a key limitation, right?
Yeah.
Something about comparing studies.
Yeah, it's a really important methodological point. It's actually quite hard to do quantitative comparisons across lots of different river studies from around the world.
Why is that?
Because researchers make different choices. Which distance metric do they use? Straight line, watercourse, cost distance? How do they handle the data mathematically? What other environmental factors do they include in their models?
I see.
All these choices introduce what they call contingency. For instance, if someone studies an arid system but only uses watercourse distance, assuming high connectivity like the SHM model, they might wrongly conclude that environmental factors don't matter much for biodiversity, simply because their chosen distance measure didn't reflect the real movement pathways. This variation makes big overarching comparisons tricky.
So given that challenge, what's the way forward? What does this synthesis paper suggest for future research? How do we get beyond just mapping patterns?
The big push is towards more mechanistically driven research, basically moving from just describing where species are to understanding how they got there and why they successfully established or failed to.
And how do they propose getting at those mechanisms?
A few ways. One is through more manipulative experiments, both in the field and in the lab. Using things like artificial stream channels, microcosms, where you can control network structure or connectivity and directly test how it affects dispersal success.
Yeah.
They also advocate for really refining those cost distance models we talked about, making the cost surfaces much more specific to the traits of the organism you're studying. Like, how much shade does this particular insect need to cross a gap? Factoring that in.
And there was a point about moving beyond single traits, too.
Yes, and this is maybe one of the most forward-looking points. Moving away from focusing on just one trait, like big wings means good disperser, towards understanding complex life history strategies.
What does that mean in practice?
It means recognizing that just having the physical ability to disperse a long way, like having big wings, doesn't automatically mean you'll be successful at recruitment. That is actually establishing a new reproducing population at the other end.
Ah, right. The journey versus the arrival and settling in.
Exactly. There's evidence suggesting that sometimes the individuals that travel the absolute furthest are actually less likely to successfully found a new population. Maybe they arrive exhausted or in the wrong condition. The real successful founders might be individuals that disperse shorter distances but arrive ready to reproduce.
So, wrapping up our deep dive then.
Mm-hmm.
The big takeaway seems to be that the river network's role in shaping life is incredibly flexible. It's all about context.
Mm-hmm.
The rules change depending on the organism. Can it fly, swim, crawl?
Yeah.
And a landscape is it wet and connected or dry and fragmented. That context dependency is really the name of the game in river metacommunities.
It really is. And that leads directly to our final thought, something for you to mull over. We tend to assume that the species physically capable of traveling the furthest are the key colonizers. But if that ability to disperse far doesn't always translate into successful recruitment, if the long-distance travelers often fail, what could we learn by looking closer, maybe using detailed genetics, at individual variation? Who are the actual successful founders establishing new communities? Understanding that gap between dispersal potential and actual establishment success, that feels like the real frontier here.